am. And one of the things that I study are pollination systems. So I'm really interested in the interactions between plants and animals and the complex repercussions that these have for both ecological communities and for evolution. So if I were to say to you that something tasted like the nectar of the gods, you might assume that that thing would taste delicious. And we make this assumption for two reasons. We assume it first because we assume that the whole point of nectar is to taste delicious. And the second is that we assume that if it tastes delicious for the gods, when presumably they can drink anything they want, then it would also taste delicious for us. And yet, here's a species called Aloe that calls into question these assumptions. So this is a species in South Africa. You might be familiar with the genus Aloe through aloe vera, which is a species that you often use for sunburns. So it has really succulent leaves, and you break it, and it makes this juice, and you can put it on your skin and you feel better. But if you haven't been to Africa, if you only know aloes from North America, you might not know that they also produce these incredible arrays of flowers and have really diverse flowering pollination systems. So this is a species, so in my master's degree I studied the pollination systems of aloes, and we were especially interested in this species because it's quite different from other aloes. The first way it's different is that most aloes have a fairly narrow flower, and so it's quite tubular, and the opening is very narrow. And this species has a big, wide opening, so that makes it unusual. But there's also another thing that is unusual about this species. And so if you look at this photo, does anything strike you as strange? What struck us as strange is that you can see the nectar here. And so we don't actually see nectar very often. We know it's in flowers, but you don't get to see it a lot. But it's usually clear and colorless. And so this species produces this dark black nectar, which is incredibly unusual in the floral world. So we were interested in it for that reason. And I was studying the pollination, and one of the things that you do when you study pollination is you measure amounts of nectar. And you do it by, you have these little glass tubes, and you stick it in the flower, you suck up the nectar, and then you blow it into a little vial. And if you do this often enough, sooner or later you make a mistake and you get a bunch of the nectar in your mouth. And what we noticed is that when we got nectar from this species, usually nectar just tastes like sugar. This species, it tasted bitter. So it was this really unpleasant tasting nectar, which is very strange. So this is not what one expects when one thinks of nectar. And it calls into question those two assumptions. So I'm going to come back to this species at the end of the talk and resolve this mystery of why a species would have disgusting tasting nectar. But first I want to do a little overview of pollination with you. So the flowers are really diverse in their shapes, but they tend to share a few things in common. Most flowers are both male and female, so they're hermaphrodites. And they make pollen in what are called the anthers, so these are the male parts. And in order to reproduce and make seed, the pollen has to get from the anthers up here to the female part here, which is called the stigma. And so plants face a really obvious problem in doing this, which is that they can't move. So whereas an animal can go out and look for a mate, a plant is stuck. And so does anybody know how plants get around this? Yeah?
Lots of ways.
Yeah, lots of ways. Can you think of one?
Animals.
Yeah, so lots of plants make use of animals as pollinators, and they lure the animals to the flower, and they rub their pollen all over the animals, and then when the animal visits another flower, it smears some of that pollen onto that other flower stigma, and that's how plants reproduce. So in order to get the animals to the flowers, plants have to offer them something. And so this is an example of just what you were talking about. So this is a bumblebee, and this bumblebee is feeding on nectar, and it's also collecting pollen. So it's sticking, so bees have what we think of as a tongue, but it's called a proboscis. and they stick it into the flower as far as they can, and they suck up the nectar like through a straw. And they also collect pollen with their legs, and they store it either on their abdomens or they store it in little pouches on their legs. And so these are the two rewards that most flowers offer to animals to bribe them to come and be pollinators, nectar and pollen. And so this has resulted in this incredible diversity of flowers. So flowers have evolved to make use of lots of different pollinators. These include bees that we see above, butterflies, bats, and hummingbirds. And each of these groups of animals has a slightly different shape and different tastes and different behaviors. And so flowers have evolved to be really different in their shapes and what they offer to attract different pollinators. So when pollination works, this is what it looks like. So up in this top picture, you can see this is a honeybee. Honeybees have really short proboscises, and this is a small flower. So it has to stick its head all the way in. It gets covered with that blue pollen, and that's great for the flower so that when it goes to the next flower, it can deposit some of that pollen. This is a sphinx moth, and you can see sphinx moths have these incredibly long proboscises. And then this last example is another aloe species. So this is a megachilid bee, and it's smooshed its head all the way into this flower. And you can see that it's collecting the orange pollen on its stomach here. And this is actually the flower's stigma. So you can see the stigma is really close to collecting the pollen. So this is what the plants are going for. This is what they want. However, the problem is that the animals don't really care about pollinating. The animals are all in it for themselves. And so they will do whatever it takes to get sweet, delicious nectar. And they don't even care if it comes from a flower. So this is a hummingbird drinking some delicious, sweet, sugary drink. And so from the flower's perspective, this is a problem. So flowers are visited not only by the pollinators that they're trying to get, but by lots of animals that vary a lot in their shape, and all of these animals only want the rewards. So what this leads to, here we have two more examples. So here are hummingbirds visiting fuchsia flowers, and in both cases these birds have nice short bills that pretty much match the length of the flower, and as they insert their bills, you can see that they're likely to contact the anthers here with the pollen, and the anthers are right here, and then the stigma is here, a little further down. But fuchsia are also visited by other hummingbirds. So we look at this hummingbird. This is a swordbill, that's right, a swordbill hummingbird from Ecuador with an incredibly long bill. And so you can see that there's no way that the feathers of this bird are ever going to contact the reproductive parts of the flower. So it's going to suck out all the nectar and not do any pollinating in return. So another example, these are the moths I showed you before. In the top, you can see the moth and the gladiolus flower it pollinates, and the proboscis is exactly as long as the tube of the flower, and the moth's head will be right here, which is right where the flower wants it. But in these two examples, this moth's incredibly long proboscis means that its body is nowhere near the parts that the plant wants it to touch. And animals can get even sneakier. So this is a honeybee, and it's actually drilling a hole in this flower, right through the flower into the nectar. And so animals don't only steal nectar, they also steal pollen. This is an austral parakeet, and they're found in Chile and Argentina. And parrots can actually be good pollinators. So there's lots of parrots in Australia that pollinate. But for this particular tree species, while I said that most flowers have both male and female parts, this tree separates its male and female parts. So it has some flowers that are just male and make pollen, and some flowers that are just female and don't make any pollen. And this parakeet loves pollen. And so it goes around to all the male flowers and eats pollen, but it doesn't visit any of the female flowers. And so there's no way that it will ever pollinate. And it eats an incredible number of flowers from these trees. So here we have a collage of animals acting as thieves. And as I said, there's both nectar and pollen theft. I tend to think of pollen theft because it's a bigger problem from the plant's perspective. So if a plant loses nectar, it's lost a way to attract pollinators. If a plant loses pollen, it's lost not only a way to attract pollinators, but it's lost the actual thing that's involved in the pollination. And you can see that most of these animals, most of them are insects, and they're all very small. But what's also interesting is that a lot of these animals are also pollinators. So they pollinate some species of plants, but on other plants where they don't match them very well, they act as thieves. So this leaves this big conundrum from a plant's perspective. How do you draw in the animals that you want while protecting your nectar and pollen from the animals you don't want? So that's the title of today's talk, which is Fortress Flower. So we're thinking about how plants can protect their pollen and nectar from pollen and nectar thieves. So one way to think about this is to think about treasure, and think about every pirate story and every medieval castle story you've ever read, and think about how people try and protect treasure. So can anyone think of one way that you might try and protect your treasure from would-be robbers if you had some? What do pirates do with treasure? They what? They bury it, right, so you can try and hide it. That's a good option. Let's see. Has anyone read Harry Potter books? So Harry Potter, when he needs to sneak around without being found, what does he use? He wraps himself in it. Yeah, the invisibility cloak? Right, okay, so you can try and be invisible. What else might you do? You could, so say you're in a castle. How do people protect castles? You might, so say, let's see. So if you had a big castle, sometimes you would have people lined up against here, waiting for enemies to attack. What do you call those people? Yeah, guards, exactly. So you could try and employ guards. Let's see. Has anybody watched Guardians of the Galaxy? Did you? And so at the very end, when the bad guy has the magic orb and the good guy starts his dance routine, do you remember that scene? What's he trying to do? He's trying to distract him, right? So you as a flower can try and distract the bad pollinators away from your good nectar and pollen. So we're going to talk about each of these. So we'll talk about trying to hide the treasure, different ways to hide it. We'll talk about ways to distract your enemies away from the things you care about. We'll talk about something we didn't talk about, which are ways to try and lock your treasure away, so you can make barriers, or you can need a secret password. You can hire guards like this dragon, and then you can also try and make your treasure poisonous, or at least unappetizing. So we'll start with hiding. So one way to hide or escape for a plant is you can escape in time. So most of those pollen thieves we looked at, all those photos were taken by day. So one potential way to escape all of those daytime insects is to offer your pollen at night. And this is great for some species that are pollinated by nocturnal animals like bats or moths. So bats are for the most part nocturnal. And so if you're a flower that's pollinated by a bat, you tend to open at night instead of during the day. And this means that the bats have first access to the pollen. So you can see this bat's doing a really good job. It's got this beard of white pollen. And so by the time the bees wake up, hopefully most of your pollen has gone into reproduction already. And bats are actually really amazing pollinators. So this is a little bat totally covered in yellow pollen. The problem with bats is that they're a bit aggressive. So they have sharp teeth, and they have sharp claws, and they just totally grab onto a flower. And so you can think a lot of delicate flowers, they couldn't really take bat pollination. And then the only other problem with bat pollination is that nectar-feeding bats are mostly found in the tropics. So that's not going to work for many species in the area we live in. But it's still a good strategy, escaping in time. Another way is you can escape in appearance, so you can hide, just like we were talking about with the invisibility cloak. So there are some people who studied a group of cacti, and so they looked at all of the cacti, and what they were interested in was the color of the pollen. So what they noticed is that cacti that are pollinated by insects tend to have this bright yellow pollen. And other studies have found that insects really like bright yellow pollen. And what they thought was really interesting is that there's a whole group of cacti that are pollinated by birds, and that these species often have really dull pollen that matches the flower. And so you can see this species here has purple pollen, which is really, really unusual. And again, you can see the purple pollen here, and they had brown or red or any kind of pollen that didn't stand out. And so the hypothesis is that the hummingbirds don't care about pollen. They just want the nectar. And so the plant here is trying to make its pollen as unnoticeable as possible so that it still gets the hummingbirds through the nectar, but it doesn't attract any bees to eat the pollen. So that's one way of hiding. I promised we would talk about distraction, and this plant has a really interesting system. So it has, instead of having one type of anthers, it has 3 types. So it has these anthers here, so they're making pollen. This is its female stigma, so these anthers are right in line with this stigma. It has a second type of anther that's right in the middle, it makes good pollen, and then it has what are called decoy anthers. So these are the things up here, and you can see them again here and here. And they look pretty different. And so they do make pollen, it turns out, but the pollen is not very good quality. It doesn't do a lot of fertilizing, and the plants save a lot of resources by just making this kind of junk pollen. But what it does do is it makes this huge yellow area, like a big bullseye, for pollinators to go to. So if you're a pollinator and you're approaching the plant from, this is a little spazzy, I'll just act it out. So you're approaching the flower like this. You can, here you're only seeing the backs of these anthers, so you don't even notice those two, right? They're just blue. And you head straight towards that big yellow area, and you chow down on all the fake pollen. Meanwhile, the plant sneakily is using these anthers to get pollen on your sides, which is right in the perfect position for you to later put it on a different plant stigma. So these plants have distracted the pollinators with this fake pollen and have sneakily arranged to get good pollen right where they want them. Pollinators are attracted to pollen not only visually, like through this bright yellow pollen, but lots of pollen actually produces a smell. And so this is an interesting species. It also has decoy pollen, so it produces pollen that's totally not fertile, it's totally junk, and that pollen produces a really strong smell. So when the pollinator gets to a flower, it goes straight to this smelly, delicious smelling, but ultimately fake pollen, and it totally ignores the real pollen. So it's a combo of hiding and decoy. Next, I want to talk about the sort of the locking, physical, secret password mechanisms that flowers use. So this strategy, it really relies on differences between pollinators that you want and visitors, pollen thieves, nectar thieves that you don't want. And if those two groups of animals are really different, then you can make some sort of strategy where only the good pollinators have the ability to get your nectar and pollen. So this is a cool species from from Australia called, it's a Banksia genus, and it has an inflorescence made up of tons of these tiny, tiny little flowers. So you can see that there are sort of these wires, like wiry things here, and then the tip of the flower is yellow, and there's thousands of them in this big gathering called an inflorescence. And the way these flowers work is shown in this diagram. So you have the flowers start growing, and that round little bit catches the reproductive part. So that's where all the action is happening. As the style grows, it's under pressure. So it's getting longer and longer, but the tip of it can't move. And so it's like a spring loading with more and more and more pressure. And then eventually, if it gets a strong knot, it pops open. And so this style goes from being all bent to springing open, and it whacks pollen onto whatever triggered it. And so Banksia are pollinated by birds. These are honey eaters in Australia, and as the honey eaters probe the flowers spring open and they smack the bird's feathers with pollen. Banksia are also visited by honeybees, but honeybees are too small to trigger the flowers, so they never have access to the freshest pollen. And there's also hundreds of little beetles that live on these flowers that eat pollen. They eat huge amounts of pollen, but they never get the fresh pollen either because they're too little to spring this trigger mechanism. So the plants do lose a lot of pollen and nectar to thieves, but they at least get it on the pollinators first. A similar strategy, so this is the secret password part. Has anyone seen flowers like this before? There's species like this through most of Canada, and what's really interesting, so these are called shooting stars, and what's interesting here is you can see the stigmas. The stigmas look pretty normal, but the anthers are grouped into a cone. And so these are what are called poricidal anthers. So what it means is that instead of each anther just opening and having this powdery pollen, either each anther individually is a little cone, or they combine to form a cone, and all of the pollen stays on the inside. And then at the very bottom, there's what's called a pore, or a little opening. And so if you were just a little pollen munching beetle and you flew up to this flower, you wouldn't be able to find any pollen. The pollen is all hidden on the inside. And in order to release the pollen, these flowers have to be vibrated. And they have to be vibrated at a really specific frequency. This is what happens if you get the right frequency. So this is someone holding one of those flowers, and they've actually found an electric toothbrush that happens to have exactly the right frequency. And they buzz the flower with it, and it shoots out this incredible amount of pollen. And in the natural world, the animals that do this are bumblebees. So the bumblebee lands on the flower, and bumblebees have adapted to vibrate their flight muscles. So they're not actually moving their wings, but they just shiver their flight muscles at just the right frequency, and the pollen shoots out. Other bees, like honeybees, can't do this. Beetles can't do it, flies can't do it. So this flower has this super selective mechanism where only the bumblebees can access the pollen. So wouldn't it be great if you as a flower could hire someone to protect the pollen or nectar from the nectar and pollen thieves? In the Melastoma genus, so you can see it has these same poricidal anthers, and there's the stigma. But this species has evolved to secrete this sugary substance on its flower and on the stem. And this sugary substance attracts ants. And you can see it attracts these vicious ants. These are pinchers. They're aggressive, and they defend their territory. And so what's interesting about these ants is that the carpenter bees, that are the pollinators, are big enough that they don't really care about the ants. So they're not bothered. So the pollinators will still come and pollinate. But the pollen thieves, those little bees, are not that much bigger than the ants, and they really don't like the ants. And so the presence of ants on these flowers keeps the thieves away while letting the pollinators in. So that is a pretty good system. The last system I want to talk about is this really interesting idea of being able to turn what is a delicious reward for some pollinators into a poisonous or at least a really distasteful substance for pollen and nectar thieves. And so this brings us back to that first species that I talked about, Alobraihydensis, and its mysterious, dark, bitter-tasting nectar. So it turns out that the main pollinators of this species are birds just like this white-eye with short little fat beaks. And so the short fat beak fits perfectly into these short flat flowers. And you can see that that bird's face is right in the jumble of anthers and stigmas. And so it collects the pollen right on its feathers, and then it moves the pollen from plant to plant. This is another photo. It's also a white-eye, and here you can actually even see the anthers and stigmas making contact with the bird's head. So these birds are really good about pollinating this plant. But what's interesting about the white-eyes and all the other short-billed birds that visit this plant is that they're what we call occasional nectivores. So unlike a hummingbird or a sunbird in South Africa that only feed on nectar, these birds just feed on nectar some of the time. The other parts of the time they feed on nuts, on seeds, on insects. And nuts and seeds and insects all share something in common, which is that they're much more bitter than nectar. So what we thought is maybe this bitter nectar tastes just fine to these pollinators, but is just a little bit too bitter for animals that are used to sweet nectar. So the reason that this could work really well for the plant is I think obvious when you look at the shape of the flowers and the bird's bills. So this is one of these flowers just pulled out and put sideways, and you can see that the anthers are really spread apart, and so is the stigma, and they're just the right length for a bird like this to pollinate. So as the bird is here and gets the nectar, this is all aloe pollen all over its face, and you can see that the anthers and stigma are going to make really good contact with that bird's face and feathers. On the other hand, this is a sunbird. So sunbirds, Africa doesn't have any hummingbirds, it has sunbirds instead, but they have the very similar long, skinny bill. And you can see that this bird is not nearly as good a match for this flower. So if this flower was here, first of all, it's wide enough that it might not be contacting the bill at all. And then if it is contacting the bird, it's only contacting the hard, smooth surface of the bill, which doesn't hold a lot of pollen and is really easy for the bird to clean. So sunbirds are huge nectar consumers, but they wouldn't necessarily be very good pollinators. So then we did an experiment where we offered short-billed birds and sunbirds different options. And so we did this using these little artificial flowers. So these are just little plastic cones, and we taped around them. So some of them we just taped with yellow tape, so they look yellow all the way through. Some of them we taped with black tape first and then yellow tape, so it looks like they have black nectar in them. And we offered these to the birds, and we thought maybe sunbirds don't like black. Maybe they're turned off by black. But it turns out that's not true. The sunbirds totally didn't care. Neither did the white-eyes or other short-billed birds. All of them drank all the nectar from those two types of cups. So then we thought, okay, well maybe it's something about the nectar specifically. So we filled these cups up, one with just a little sugar solution, and one with nectar that actually came from this species. And when we gave it to the short-billed birds, they didn't care again. They just drank all the nectar in the little cups. When we gave it to the sunbirds, they had the type of reaction that you might expect if you fed a dog or a cat something really disgusting. So they tried it, and as soon as they tried it, they pulled their beaks out and they shook it, and they flew straight to the other side of the cage. And they did this repeatedly, so they didn't like this dark, bitter nectar at all. We did the same trials with honeybees. For most aloe species, honeybees will collect both pollen and nectar. But when we offer this nectar to honeybees, they don't like it. And so what we think is that for honeybees too, this keeps the bees at the level of the anthers and stigmas where they can transfer pollen and stops them from consuming the rich nectar resources where they'd be less able to transfer pollen. So this species seems to have this amazing system where it has developed this bitter nectar to filter out undesirable flower visitors. What would be really cool is if plants could do this with pollen as well. And we have some evidence that maybe they can, although it's not nearly as well studied. So pollen varies a lot in its shape. These are different pollen grains from different species, and you can see that some of them are really spiky. And certain animals like honeybees don't like spiky pollen. So this might be a way of protecting your pollen from some pollen collectors. Cotton has really spiky pollen, okra has really spiky pollen, and bees don't collect it. Also, there are lots of plants that are pollinated not by animals, but by wind. And so if you're wind pollinated, then you don't have to make your pollen taste good at all, because the wind doesn't care. So some wind pollinated species have lots of volatile chemicals in their pollen, which could act to maybe deter bees from eating it. And then finally, this really interesting species from Brazil has pollen that is collected by native pollinators, but is poisonous to exotic pollinators. And so it shows that potentially even for plants where pollinating animals are their pollinators, there's potential to filter between them. The one other thing that plants have done with pollen, but only a few plants, is this strategy used by two different groups. Does anyone recognize the flowers at the top? Those are really unique and quite distinctive flowers, and they come from milkweeds. So they have this really beautiful flower shape with these sort of curled holes and openings around in a cone, and they offer nectar. But instead of offering powdery pollen, their pollen is packaged into tight little balls called pollinia. So you can see these are two honeybees, and that honeybee you can see really easily has little yellow balls stuck to its leg. And so that's the species, the milkweed's pollen. Does anyone know what type of flower this is? No? It's an orchid. And so orchids have the same strategy. Orchids also, most species at least, package their pollen into tight little groups called pollinia. And so what people have noticed is that the major pollen eaters out there, which are the honeybees especially, don't like pollinia. And so these bees, which would usually be collecting lots of pollen and then feeding it to their young, in this case, they can't get the pollinia off them, and they can't eat it either. So orchids and milkweeds have developed this fantastic way of avoiding pollen consumption by the most voracious pollen eaters. And so that takes us through the defense mechanisms that I said we would talk about. But there's one other adaptation that plants use that doesn't really fit into our metaphor of fortresses or pirates, because humans haven't really figured out how to do it with treasure. And people think that this might be because orchids now use these pollinia, and it's been such a great idea that it's allowed them to evolve really interesting, intricate pollination systems. So I'm just going to tell you about this last strategy. These are orchid flowers. But do they look like anything else when you look at them if you kind of squint? Yep.
They look like female bees.
They look like female bees. So I see that you have perhaps encountered these before. And male bees think exactly the same thing. So not only do these flowers look incredibly like female bees, but they produce a chemical scent that's the same as the pheromone that female bees produce. So they look like female bees, and they smell like female bees, and they totally fool male bees. And so the male bees fly down, and they visit them, and they check them out, and they're trying to figure out, there's something not quite right with this female. And as they're trying to figure it out, the orchid is sneakily planting its pollinia right on their face. And eventually, the bee figures out, okay, this isn't another bee, and it flies off. But bees aren't that smart, and so it goes off to another orchid and transfers the pollen. And so these orchids, they only offer these pollinia, which are totally not edible, and they don't offer any nectar at all. So instead of having to defend their nectar, they just lure the pollinators in through tricks and deceit and save themselves the bother of having to defend delicious nectar resources. And so there's a whole genus of orchids that do this, and it's led to these incredible, intricate flower arrangements that mimic the scent and the fuzziness and the shape and size and coloring of different bee species. And my personal favorite is this one, which I think has to be one of the weirdest flowers and most intricate flowers in the whole world, and is definitely way cool and totally works. So there's a bee trying to figure out if it's got a hot date. So that's the whole array of mechanisms that flowers have adapted to separate the good pollinators from the bad pollinators. So even though we usually think of flowers as being these sweet things that kind of can't move and do much, I want you to come away from this talk thinking of them instead as these master manipulators. So flowers can't move, but they've evolved incredible strategies to lure animals to them, to make the animals behave how they want them to, and to stop the animals from taking advantage of the resources that they offer. So that's